with that, I guess we can have what do you call it? Yeah, we can have opening government whenever they're ready. As you go up to do your speeches, please introduce yourselves, and you can put your POI preferences and ask for your POI preferences as well. So on the motion, this House supports the introduction of green antitrust policies. I call upon opening government to start the debate.
So, hello, wait me a minute. I'm just need to put my timer, but in the meantime, I want to thanks to Juan Esteban. I want to thanks all the debate teams here. I'm super excited to be here, and I just hope this goes well because I want this to be a great debate. So, yeah, saying that, let's see. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. The only opportunity to have to compete in the actual market of energy is the possibility to literally reduce the power of these companies of carbon intense firms. What I'm going to prove in my speech is that the carbon intense firms are too big, and for that they are abusing the market, and this is the only way to reduce the targeting power that they have. If I'm able to prove that to you, we're going to win. So first, in terms of how these carbon intense firms works and why they're like problematic in the status quo. Notice that these carbon intense firms are like very big in the ground. What is that? For 4 reasons. First, because this is like a natural monopoly because of they need a lot of space to, for example, do the mining, do the structural, like to refine the miners and everything about it. Second, because this sector is very relevant in all the economy, so the government would allocate a lot of money in terms of their production and their opportunity to exist. And third, because historical they have like agreements in markets to allow them, for example, to be involved in terms of transportation or to be involved in terms of the basic energy sector, right? What happened with these like cooperative market circumstances is that they constantly abuse their power in terms of their possibilities. They are not actually like investing in innovation on the probability of transform their energies or their allocation of it. They are actually investing in terms like doping or things like on unfair competition. That what it means is like I go, for example, for lower prices for being like the best enterprise and be the one that you are buying it, or in the second term you are like dealing exclusive agreements with your chain of supplies, and making, for example, not be able to other companies to actually interact with your suppliers, or for example to be able to equalize the price of the market. What does means is when I like make this measure and limit, for example, the possibilities of power in the ground, is when I don't going to have this that like these unfair competitiveness strategies, and I'm going to explain you why by 3 things. First, how this measure looks like. Notice something. The limit of vertical integrations means that, for example, you have you need to not do like exclude like being in the same of the exclusive providers, because you are now don't having like this enterprises integration. Why they already have it? Because they are able like to, for example, buy the one sector that it allocates their resources, and when they're buying them they can like just use for them, or they can just like provide for themselves whatever they want, and they can put the market prices, like in terms of the provisions, like the machines or for example the own like transporting stuff or things like that. So when I limit the integration, it's more probable that in my side of the house there's an opportunity to negotiate with actually these actors and to be able to compete in terms of these providers, and not in terms of these people just putting their money and putting their best the most amount of money to just innovate the others to enter into the market. But in the second place, noting how if I limit, for example, in the hasher market share, I limit your capacity of having investors, that means that you can split in more participations. What does mean? That in terms of the market and the possibility of gain some kind of amount of money in terms of the investments, it is more likely that you need to create new, for example, shares in other type of enterprises like the green ones, or in other type of energy enterprises that are offering this. So that makes that investors think that they have another opportunity to allocate their money, and there is like a more secure sector because it's actually be able to compete with the big, right? So, but to explain this, how literally change the market and make better policies in terms of the opportunity of these enterprises, I'm going to explain in 1 minute. Please give me the PR.
Right, so thus far, you've only explained that we should just do more antitrust across the board. You haven't explained why there should be a differential between green and non-green companies.
Oh, I can explain you very easily. So first, in terms of the negotiation and in terms of the background of the companies, right? Notice that if they are like, the sectors are very different for 3 reasons. First, because in terms of the green energy sectors, this is like a very like innovative sector that comes, for example, for literally for other countries that are more focused on this. For example, for example, in China or Asian countries that are focusing on investing in green energy. First. Second, because these sectors is actually not co-opting all the market instead. There are actually a lot of competition because the governments wants to do this transformation because they actually see how happens to depend in the oil industry, in the gas industry for every the backlash of Ukraine and everything that is happening around gas. So they mean that these are sectors that are actually no co-optive for all these like bad incentives that actually have in the other side. But in the second term, it's more about like the amount of capital. These companies are not that big. These companies are actually trying to emerge in this market. So that means that they don't have like the budget to just reduce the competition in the sites, and they actually have the opportunity to compete. Notice that if they are able to compete, there are 3 incentives that we apply. In the worst case of the scenario of these companies, they have actually the possibility to win this kind of contract. They have actually the possibility to win transport or have these institutions. But in the second term, the speculation market change. The people at least think that they are actually going to receive some kind of retribution of this market, so they invest more in this sector. But in the other side, in the transformation, you don't want to perceive this kind of measures being the big company, so you invest more in not do this kind of unjust competitive mails, but better to diversify and to buy more sustainable supplies or something like that. Thank you so much.
Cool. You're here. Invite the leader of opposition to open up the case for the opposition bench.
All right, everyone ready? Perfect. POIs in the chat, please, preferably from CG. Okay. Call me Hasbro the way monopolies are my favorite thing in the world. We're going to explain something very, very simple. Why this policy massively fucks over green technology in the short and long run, why that leads to higher emissions, and why climate change, not the economy, is the most important thing in the debate. First thing I want to counterprop here. We directly price carbon as an externality of production into firms, i.e. through things like a carbon tax, and we're willing to break up and reduce the strength of fossil fuel lobbies to get better and more comprehensive regulation on firms. We're going to explain why this lets you not only better regulate firms, why this gives firms an independent, much stronger incentive to not only make the transition over to green technology, but why independently you get these things on our side of the house uniquely. The second thing I want to say on this debate is that the climate is probably like just by far the most important impact in this debate. Why? 3 structural reasons. Firstly, it affects future generations as well as present generations. Insofar as we think future generations probably matter morally, and they matter far greater on scope than present generations, climate change is an extremely large-scale impact. Secondly, it affects non-human animals and non-human life to a very significant degree. Climate change is directly responsible for destroying the habitats of trillions of wild animals. Insofar as that is the case, it is probably important to reduce raw emissions to prevent this on net. I'll actually take the clarification now.
You don't have fiat, this has supports. Go back and mech all those things.
Yeah, sure. I was actually just about to do that and explain why green firms like make the transition independently. Don't worry about that. I understand. Yeah, sorry. Not, to be clear, we don't have fiat on our side of the house. We are willing to do this anyways. The third thing I want to explain is just generally speaking, insofar as climate change is the most important impact, it is critically important to make the transition over to things like green technology now in order to do this in the first place. Why then is there an incentive in the status quo on the part of both governments and large pollutant firms to make this transition, filling in that POI that they was so helpfully asked? The first is large pollutant firms have a strong incentive to diversify their investments in the status quo because things like natural gas are finite resources. They know they are finite resources, and so they're going to need to have to make the transition eventually. They're going to be willing to put significant money into this now. Secondly, they aren't fucking morons. They know climate change is real, and it probably hurts their bottom line if the planet gets destroyed. They want to be able to do this anyways. Thirdly, there's substantial public pressure in the status quo put on these large pollutant firms to do things like reduce pollution. If you have a large, concentrated, vertically integrated firm, there is still a strong incentive to reduce pollution. Finally, there's also just independently in the status quo, massive efforts to subsidize green energy. See, like not only the things like the European Green Deal, but also Biden era climate subsidies that have like substantially subsidized green energy in the status quo. ExxonMobil is empirically the largest funder of green technology in the entire world. And we're going to argue that they have a better capacity to do this when you enforce antitrust policies and break them up into smaller firms. Two arguments then. The first is why they lower the efficiency of these firms massively and therefore increase pollution on net in the short term. The characterization here is that yes, these firms are large natural monopolies, and so by breaking them up, you create a large competitive incentive to pollute more in the short term to recapture market share. What is the basic characterization here? When you break up a large firm and there are suddenly lots of smaller competing firms competing over the same sectors, i.e. attempting to supply energy, there is one, a short-term competitive incentive to lower prices on things like natural gas and oil, but two, a long-term incentive to try to double down and recapture market share that you previously had as a natural monopoly by reinvesting more into dirty pollution and sources of dirty energy instead of doing the transition over to green energy, because suddenly it's massively more profitable for you to attempt to recapture market share your firm previously had instead of speculating into a new sector. That means the short-termist incentive on the part of both firms and consumers is to consume more energy and thus to increase pollution massively. I already explained why pollution is the most important impact in this debate. The second is that there is a lock-in and time lag effect, i.e. these firms, when you break them up, there needs to be a substantial period of time where you're attempting to redistribute and reparcel resources that were previously consolidated into a monopoly. This is the type of time when a firm is least likely to engage in research and development or speculative activities because you're looking to minimize risk to maximize the potential that you survive in the long term as a firm, meaning you're substantially less likely to fund green R&D efforts in the first place. But thirdly, you have far less regulatory consistency. Insofar as bodies like the EPA now have to regulate 10 fucking oil companies instead of just one oil company that was able to previously monopolize the field. Your ability to standardize regulations and importantly, to enforce that regulation gets substantially lower on their side of the debate because you have to have specialized regulations for every separate firm instead of being able to consolidate. I also think if they're going to run an argument about how lobbying decreases regulations, I think the impact of lobbying on regulations is actually somewhat overblown. It's the much more important argument is the regulatory capacity of these bodies insofar as they have incentives to want to reduce climate change because there's probably the public pressure mechanism that I already explained. The last thing I want to explain is just why these firms are generally better at funding green technology in the first place, even in Gov's best case, where smaller like fossil fuel companies do still want to transition and make funding to green company to like transition over their grids and partner with green companies and do this type of partnerships in the first place. First, large companies have higher compensation on net because they have more capital on hand, and so they attract better talent and higher knowledge pools. Secondly, there's just more operational efficiency because you are more vertically integrated, which allows you to make the transition over to green energy much, much more rapidly. Empirically, this is what we have seen firms like ExxonMobil do. They have been transitioning to green technology. They've been building shit tons of solar farms in places like Texas because they know that they need to make the switch now in order for their business to remain profitable. By breaking up these firms, you destroy their incentive to make any kind of transition over to green technology in the future because instead of simply having a bunch of small green tech firms that can also innovate and do these products in collaboration with the larger firms that previously existed, now the large firms have to attempt to recapture that market share that you've locked them out of in the first place. base. The final thing I want to explain is why the partnerships between small firms, like small green tech firms, are better when you have large fossil fuel firms. There's two ways here. First, you have substantially higher VC tolerance for funding these firms insofar as you can do things like get partnerships with ExxonMobil as a natural monopoly that already exists. Because when you are a small firm, often the best way for a small green tech firm to break into the market is to partner with an existing fossil fuel supplier and then diffuse their technology much more rapidly because you have that customer base that is already bought in instead of having to recapture that market share and customer base. But secondly, there's a higher propensity and willingness to take moonshot risks, extremely high risk, high reward project that is only possible when you have excess capital and the capacity to take losses that a monopolistic firm uniquely possesses. This means that emissions get way, way fucking higher on their side of the debate. Emissions are the most important metric because it isn't too late. We have not passed the point of no return. Insofar as we are willing to cut back on our pollution in the status quo, that means that pollution is going to go down on our side of the house, which affects not only the most vulnerable and long-term stakeholders in the debate, but it just outweighs every other impact on scope and magnitude. I don't fucking care if natural gas gets cheaper. It's horrible for the planet. Oppose.
Cool. I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to wrap up the case for opening government.
Hi, before I start, can you tell me if I'm audible?
Yep.
Thank you. So, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1 now. In the status quo, green companies have the money and the governmental support to enter the market, but they have structural problems that are being an obstacle to compete in the market. What is these structural problems? First of all, we are talking about that they do not have access to the change of productions. That is to say that they do not have contracts with providers because the providers are already captured by exclusive contracts with carbon intensive firms. That is to say that I cannot have a contract with this enterprise of transportation because they already have a contract with the carbon intensive firms and they do not let these new green companies to operate with these providers. This is something that already happened historically, is what happened with Standard Oil in the United States. But second of all, the carbon intensive firms make predatory practices in the status quo when they compete with green companies. Why this is the case? Because historically, these firms haven't had competition at all. They maybe have competition between other carbon intensive firms, but they already have collusion to have an agreement about prices, but with competing with green companies is a new competition. What they are doing in the status quo that is bad for the competition is that they are doing predatory practices, like for example, is dumping. That is to say that they trade the products in a price that is unfair because it's lower than international price. So this do not let other green companies to compete with them in the first place. And the only reason of why they cannot do that is because they have the amount of capital sufficient to do these practices at all. So let's do some rebuttal with opening opposition. First of all, opening opposition says that in the status quo, the large companies have an incentive for creating green alternatives. I want to say that this is not actually true. Yeah, maybe there are some projects in order to create green alternatives, but in the majority of cases, this is somewhat this is somehow a certain type of greenwashing. If we are seeing like the types of production of these enterprises, there are a small percentage of green alternatives in comparison with their carbon productions. That is the majority of the production in the status quo. The burden of proof of opposition is not saying that, oh, they have an incentive to do a green alternative, but it's to say why in their production capacity they are doing more green alternatives than the carbon emissions that they are doing in the status quo. I think that that's not proof at all. But second of all, I think that they do not have incentives to do this in the long run. Why? First of all, because the majority of these enterprises cares too much about the profit and created a production based in, for example, petroleum or gas is more cheap that have innovation in new green alternatives. They already have like the machines and the capital to exploit oil and to explode gas in the status quo. In order to create a new green alternative, you need to create a new investment with new machines. I think that this is a cost that in the status quo, these large enterprises are not occurring because it's not good for their shareholders in the first place. So I don't think it's true that they are doing like these green alternatives in the status quo like large enterprises. Let's talk about how the measure is going to change this situation at all. For example, in the moment that you let create limits for the investment, or for example, you do not let vertical integration, this is good. Why? Because you take away contracts from the providers from the carbon intensive firms. That is to say that I can now have access to for example, other providers or to the transport enterprise to give my products to other people or to take it to any change of production. This is something that you can only do in my side of the house. But second of all, even if it's true, even if the characterization of opening opposition is true that these large enterprises are so focused in green companies and green alternatives, I think so they are not going to be harmful in my side of the house because they are not going to be the object of the investigation or the political intervention if this is true that they care more about the green alternatives. We are only focusing this type of antitrust measures in carbon intensive firms. That is to say that in order to have this intervention, you have to do an evaluation about the production of this enterprise. If you conclude in the first place that this firm has like a 70% of his production with emissions of gas and oil, I think this is the type of actor that we are going to have an intervention. This is better in my side of the house because you change the incentives of the companies. When you create this antitrust policy only for carbon intensive firms, it's when you incentivize the investment and innovation in creating these green alternatives. I already told you why they do not have the incentives right now, but when you promise them that you are going to break their fucking monopoly, they are more likely to invest more in these things in the status quo. Before I go on, I will take the POI from the CEO.
Your case has retreated to exclusive contracts held by dirty companies, but your policy doesn't change this insofar as reducing the size of a firm doesn't annul all its contracts.
I think, first of all, if we are talking about antitrust measures, this is about the contracts also, but even if we are talking about breaking the monopolies, this is good. Why? In the status quo, this type of carbon intensive firms, because historically has been like a very secure investment, has a lot of money to do their chain production and be a more largest monopoly. When you recap this type of enterprises, they have a small or a smaller percentage of capital. That is to say that they are only going to use this type of money. With this type of money, they cannot do like dumping or they cannot do predatory prices at all because they are going to lose a lot of money in the long run. So we create like a very best environment for the market to compete. That is to say that now the green companies can compete with a very good price and not to lower them in order to compete with the carbon intensive firms. Because all of that, proud to propose.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, POS in the chat, please. To be clear, we want the environment to become better as well. We agree that it's an important problem, and we think that there's some ways, if possible, to make green technology relatively substitutable in the status quo. That'd be great. But we think that breaking up historically carbon-intensive firm is the absolutely worst way to go about this for many reasons. First, I want to take out what opening government says about antitrust laws, and just quickly taking out whether these firms who are characterizing what these carbon-intensive firms are currently doing, and why the role that they have fulfilled for people is often really, really hard for green tech to substitute, at least in the short run, and therefore requires green tech to grow far, far bigger in the long run, and can only do so when these companies are carbon-intensive companies cooperate with them when they're not broken up. But secondly, dealing with the large clash of what if green companies currently get outcompeted and they cannot grow without this motion. Firstly, let's talk about the OG or PM idea that these firms are not good because they're natural monopolies and they're really relevant in economy. Actually, by their analysis, you can see that these firms who are carbon intensive are doing very, very important jobs and often providing many, many things for people on the ground to a scale that other people often in the short term cannot fulfill for. There's a reason why they're natural monopolies. There's a reason why they're relevant in every part of economy. Maybe because, guys, they're doing a really, really important job. The ability to use things like economies of scale really provides great things for people on the ground. The way we're going to use this analysis isn't to give you an econ argument as to why it's more important to care about those benefits, but specifically proving to you the scale of which these companies are currently doing these things. And when you break them up, it is very unlikely that green companies are able to outcompete them, even with this motion in place anyways. We think that the better way for them to outcompete them is when they grow in the long run, when they're actually able to organically outcompete these natural monopolies because of all the subsidies, et cetera, that goes in these companies. The problem is you don't get the subsidy that's actually going into these companies. You don't get the forefront of the R&D and the upfront costs that you could put in these companies when you literally destroy the large companies like ExxonMobil who are currently actively investing in the green technology. They never responded to that characterization in the first place. Because let's be real, we think that government characterization is going to be a typical debate thing of these carbon-intensive companies are so bad. All they want is lobby, and all they want is to keep digging out natural gas and make the world really, really bad place. But I know this is a debate. Ask yourself, read the news recently. Is that really the case? We think that a lot of these companies already have the incentive to transition because they've captured huge amount of capital, but understand that in order for the firm to continuously grow at the rate at which they have, they cannot continuously rely on finite resources like natural gas or carbon emission. They understand that they have to transition to better ways of creating electricity, for example, and greener tech. This is the result. This is the reason why they actually have been investing in innovation in green tech. They have been pushing for organic changes. They have been allowing for a lot of these green companies to grow larger and larger, maybe not pushing their products and directly outcompeting them, but actively investing in R&D and making sure that they also capture larger amount of market share by the time these green products become competitive. So just to be clear on stance, right? I think that maybe opposition or government is a little confused as to why we're running this. We just want to be completely clear. We want green technology to substitute obviously bad forms of energy in the past because that's overall a good thing. Maybe there's some economy arguments that our closing wants to run, but we're going to win this debate from the higher burden of climate benefits anyways. Probably push engaging with government better and beating closing or whatever economy argument there's out. We specifically prove to you why green companies are better able to actually grow under our side of the house. And that's going to be the stand that I stand by. And we're going to run down as to why specifically this clash is the most important thing. Before I go on, though, I can take a POI if there's any clarification or if there's anything you want to ask. Opening, closing. Oh, sorry, closing first. Opening.
So yeah, your burden of proof is not why they are starting to use innovation in green technology, but why this is sufficient incentive to mitigate the harms that you said in the first speech.
No, so we are saying that these green companies at the moment are not good enough. The thing that's helping them grow in the status quo is ExxonMobil. What you're doing is breaking up ExxonMobil. And I'm going to talk about how that pits against many ExxonMobils against each other, therefore losing the funding that you want that goes into green technology in the first place. You might say that the government can fill in and probably give them the subsidy anyways. We think that it's incomparable to the huge amount of investment that a lot of these carbon intensive companies have poured into these green areas. And we think that it's great that they're doing this because they want want to be sustainable companies. First thing I want to say, and I'm going to run through this in my entire class, is green companies currently, like we said, cannot fill in right now per the characterization that we gave you why they're natural monopolies, right? In comparison, green technology currently are small, they're expensive. Importantly, they're not scalable, and there's not enough investment to allow them to be scalable in the first place, but that investment is constantly growing as a result of companies like ExxonMobil pouring in that money. The problem is you break these companies up, therefore losing that potentiality for being scalable in the first place. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars of building infrastructure. There's no other actor in this debate or in the world that can do the same thing as this as large carbon intensive companies like ExxonMobil. The reason why they have incentive to invest in green technology, not only for the reasons that Will told you, but for an intuition pub of also, guys, like ExxonMobil is not obsessed with natural gas for some reason, right? They just want to capture any profit potential in long run sustainably and keep running their company so they can grow at the same rate. It's much better to transition to green technology because there's just finite amount of gas and they know that there's increased amount of regulation, even absent this antitrusting, because they have to pay for things like carbon tax, but they're probably better able to evade all of these things if they're just able to transition to green technology in the long run. What changes when you break up these companies and don't allow them to vertically integrate? One, in order to scramble to get for more profit in the short run, they're like, well, fuck the whole innovative green technology thing. Let's just fucking make everything really, really cheap and pollute even more, because that's probably the safest way to get all our shareholders and increase profit in a very short margin. We think that when you change these type of incentive, you make that type of investment far less and you reduce the type of potential benefit that they want to get on their side of the house. Other alternatives are significantly better. There are already existing alternative things like carbon tax. We are already collecting a lot of these, and these are natural incentive for people like ExxonMobil to transition and subsidize green technology. There's already a transition to some extent from China and European green deals pushing for things like green technology. We think that the world is fine. You don't need green antitrust policies because we are already slowly transitioning to green tech by investing in these things. You fuck it up the moment you remove a lot of these stakeholders, the moment you remove a lot of these market holders, when they're not able to actually put their extra capital into green tech, but move all of those things away from from going back to digging for oil. So for all those reasons, if you really care about climate change, you should actually vote for opening opposition.
Here. Let's, I thank the top half for a wonderful debate and invite the member of government to open up the bottom half of this round.
Great. Everyone good? OO lost this debate when they retreated to their standpoint of, we shift slowly but surely over time. I think the mechanisms they provide only prove that maybe 50, 60 years from now, some of our energy is derived from wind energy. That's not enough because the challenge we face is on the order of 10 or 15 years, that when the point of no return is so soon, that when there are huge amounts of damage being caused by these companies operating every day, even if they prove that there's some incentive for Exxon 30 years down the line to change, that's not the delta in this debate. We're going to make a simple claim that there are certain types of technology that matter the most that only get developed by small green startups because there's no incentive for the big companies to actually develop and innovate on them. And we think that absent antitrust laws, these small pivotal technologies are the ones that get outcompeted, are the ones that get shut in the back door, they're the ones that don't receive the money and space needed to grow and actually save our environment. But first, a point of framing and then two extensions. First, I don't think that OO's comparative is actually correct. We're not breaking up these huge companies. Our comparative cannot be 5 small Exxon Mobils running around developing their own corners of the world. Because obviously, first of all, that seems like a really unfair burden to push on us. Antitrust regulation does not mean break up every large company ever. It means limit their ability to buy up other small companies. It means limit their ability to hold market share, and that's the reasonable counterfactual. But secondly, a structural reason. Obviously, if this policy would then cause huge shortfalls in the amount of energy provided to people in America or people in the world as a whole, then governments wouldn't implement it this way for the simple reason that they like to be elected and don't want a huge shortfall of energy when they break up the only 3 companies able to actually create that energy. So obviously, the delta cannot be a huge short-termist environmental problem of a bunch of companies redeveloping developing their land in the first place, a lot of OO's environmental harms are out of this debate. The first thing I'm going to talk about is big companies and where and how they pivot on either side of the house. The government claim is that these companies are already set to pivot, and I think it's really, unfortunately, super optimistic of them to claim that these companies know that there's a problem in the world. Because if these companies were in the saving the world business, then we wouldn't see the huge amounts of human rights and environmental violations that they propagate every single day for the sake of profit. The problem is that these firms are explicitly profit-seeking and short-termist. And even if it's not the people at the top who are like that, it is their investors and shareholders, people who only care about the amounts of zeros that these companies pump out, that provide perverse pressures for these companies to act in certain ways. Why do we think they don't pivot on opposition side of the house, framing out OO's best impact? First, your investors and board quite frankly don't let you start pivoting in the first place because it destroys their bottom line. It's very hard to explain to them why they need to care about these things at the point at which they themselves probably care about profit much more and have a real preference for doing so. But secondly, you can lobby down regulations much more easily. So the argument that OO makes, which is, you know that things will pivot soon, you know that governments will crack down on you soon, and therefore you're going to want to change things, really doesn't work because they are confident that they can stop any and all forms of regulation with the huge amount of money they have. Note, this regulation that we pass is the tipping point to changing that because it creates a signaling effect on these boards and on these people in general. The government is willing to actually take action, that there are consequences that will be held to them. So if they want to say that companies are risk averse and therefore pivot, they must first make it clear to them that risk actually exists, and we magnify the chance of that happening on our side of the house. But thirdly, they don't believe that the market will ever shift away from those natural gases in the first place because the existing counter market doesn't exist to begin with. So when there aren't enough green tech firms to actually provide a threat to them, that's when they don't see the need to pivot in the first place because no one's out competing them already and no one can because of their power. So even if they're shifting in ops best case, there's not just any kind of urgency or actual commitment to that shift, which gets us the timeline that we need. So the OO solution of just letting it happen doesn't stand in the long term because it doesn't work as fast as we need it to work in the first place. Why do we think that we change things uniquely on our side of the house? I think I already explained it. The first obvious reason is profit incentives. That if you are being farmed out of a part of the market now, you have to innovate and change your technology to actually access those parts of the market again. So that's the point at which you do reinvest really heavily in green tech to a much higher extent to recapture those lost forms of the market. And note, it's obvious that our policies would allow them to do this because the innate incentive behind passing our policies in the first place, the innate intention, is to create more green tech. So obviously, if Exxon turns around tomorrow in our world and says, hey, we're going to actually make way more solar farms to recapture the shares of the market we lost, obviously we're likely to let them do that to some capacity, if not the whole capacity of breaking antitrust. But secondly, I think the signaling effect mechanism is sufficient to prove this. What we do is change companies' corporate incentives and they change their decision-making structure. So now we make them realize that there is an actual threat to them that they need to pivot. We give them incentives to pivot that otherwise wouldn't exist. But the more important extension we're going to make then is on better innovation and why we only get it on our side of the house. Simple argument. Why do we uniquely enable green tech or energy companies, and why do we supercharge their innovation towards the kinds of tech that actually matter? The first thing I want to point out is I don't think OO realizes how these companies interact. They say partnerships. I'm not sure what partnerships exist when you can just buy out their venture capitalist investors, when you can just buy out the poor four guys in a shed who are trying to do these things in the first place and then simply implement your own technology. What actually happens in the real world is that Exxon holds tons of green tech patents that they buy up and just let sit on shelves somewhere so they don't have to deal with them or compete with them in the future. And the reason this happens, because OG doesn't provide you the incentives or for why they do so, is because it's comparatively cheaper than innovating or competing in these sectors yourself. Because absent of the push that we provide them, that these sectors will exist from the counterfactual anyway, there is no need for them to pivot at the point at which it's much cheaper for them to simply buy up those things and put them on the side so that their own money makers can continue to go forward. But secondly, I think we motivate way more investment into other green technology to begin with. Why? First, now the profit margins and abilities to actually exist in the market are much, much higher at the point at which antitrust exists. And this creates a signaling effect that the government will support and protect the investment in these endeavors. So you get far more venture capital pouring into these small firms, far more people willing to actually invest and put money into them in the first place, far more investment firms, for example, moving in, because now the perceived risks of these companies being bought out and their the patents trying to develop being taken out are far, far lower on our side of the house. But secondly, we think more market share opens up, which creates an incentive for companies to actually invest in the first place. Because at the point at which you think, now Exxon can only hold 80% of the market, obviously someone has filled the niche, and this creates a race to the top of investment to create the companies that will fill those niches much more, which means we prove massively higher amounts of capital flowing into these places than opening government does. The difference then that we're going to win this debate on is the type of technology you create. Because their counterfactual of big companies might pivot somewhat, but they don't do the most important things that exist in the first place. They don't make the most biggest innovations. They don't form the newest forms of technology that deviate from their pipelines. So maybe you get a slightly more green way to make oil. you definitely don't get an alternative to oil. Two simple reasons. First of all, it being too effective at doing this undercuts your main form of profit in the first place. So even if Exxon makes solar farms, they will never make good enough solar farms to replace oil because their main moneymaker is oil in the first place. But secondly, there's too big of a departure from your existing infrastructure in the models that you have already, which heightens these costs. We think, though, that obviously our green tech companies have much more incentives to innovate because of competitive incentives to actually create different forms of technology to provide unique niches in the market that create the actual innovation you need to step forward. These simple mechanisms for this are just that you have access to much more talent and money and investment, but also specifically note Will's own mechanism as to why engineers go to the biggest companies in the first place. So in ops world, when the biggest companies are doing the kinds of piecemeal, weak innovations that don't change anything, you actually sap the talent that could be going to these firms on our counterfactual. Simple weighing then. We need a big change and we need it now. We prove that these green tech companies do a type of innovation that is so much more powerful than what the big companies might do. And even if our likelihood is a little lower, we think the payoff of at least one of these companies working out has much higher rates than the environment. Proud to propose.
Cool. Thank the member of government. Invite the member of opposition to open the case for closing of the motion.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, one moment. Let's start. All right. I'll take opening, put it in the chat, please. I first want to weigh in on the bizarre definitional challenge coming from closing government. Two comments here. Firstly, if it's true that they don't have to stand by actual breaking up, their case is just self-mitigated. I don't know what signaling effect you get if you don't actually crack down on these firms. But also, secondly, breaking up the firms is the reasonable burden in this debate, which your opening took in a natural reading of the motion. It isn't unfair, and you cannot just knife and back half by standing by something very different. In fact, governments often do take market harmful policies to pursue environmental protection, and that is what you have to stand by in this debate. At this point, then, let me explain what I will do in CO to actually extend on this motion. Important observation and framing is that this is a support debate. This means that we cannot assume that it happens everywhere or in every country, and should ask ourselves exactly where this motion takes place. It has to occur, I posit, in countries where the impetus already exists for harsh antitrust policies because the harm of monopolization is already recognized in those places. These are also places already recognize the danger of climate change. Necessarily then, this motion operates in blocks like the EU or Biden's America. It doesn't happen in places where you have like very harsh monopolies that are dominating the market. Therefore, the implication here is simple. Antitrust laws in those places in the European Union are going to be hawkish on both sides of the house and sufficient to protect competition. But also, things like exclusive contracts that OG want to talk about don't exist in this debate. The question is simple. Should we artificially inflate the borders of antitrust in a manner that disrupts the balance of the market and the ability of firms to compete simply for the sake of immediate environmental gratification? The answer is a very resolute no. One simple extension from closing opposition. Why do you reduce the ability of companies to become green on their side of the house? Why it is that they would become green otherwise? And what the effect of this is? Basically going vertical and OO and just doing their analysis, but better. Four mechanisms on the first claim. One, simply the cheap technology and capacity to switch to green practices just isn't ready yet on a large scale. It is currently very expensive to produce those green goods, and we don't have the ability to make very cheap batteries or very cheap energy production to make the green cars run. Crucially, we are willing to tolerate companies who continue polluting in the short term, since there is no effective possibility for a present switch, and we want the research to continue happening. What this means then is that the burden of state government is to explain why we should force a switch even when it is too early for one to happen. That is, if we were ready for the switch, the market forces would push us in that direction, especially when you have very many pro-green consumers in those places. Additionally, though, this is not a debate just about energy producers. It's also about manufacturers. You arbitrarily benefit the manufacturers who happen to be polluting a bit less than the rest of side government, or who can access existing patents. This means that government is preventing proper market competition from delivering solutions to those problems. A few additional mechanisms, though. Secondly, you reduce the economies of scale and the access of the firms to those economies that are necessary to produce cheap products. The breaking up of a firm introduces large costs and administrative hurdles to the operation of those firms, and it also affects your ability to commit to R&D to develop those green products. The reason for this is that they're unable to bear the cost of becoming green on-site government, and this is the thing that OWO fails to explain. The reason for this is that it is very expensive to switch your supply chains to green ones, because green tech, as I explained, is currently more expensive for you to rely on, especially for complicated manufactured goods. The third reason under this claim, though, is that the freshly broken up companies and their assets are going to be very vulnerable to buyouts when you do this breakup. What this means then is that even if some firms are currently green, they're going to see purchasing these newly broken up firms as immensely profitable and will even direct money away from green growth in favor of doing so. What this therefore means then is that you now have firms with less operating capital to be able to pursue the green R&D that is necessary to bring about the research and the change we need. Second burden then, why it is that these firms would otherwise become green necessary for the upcase. Two reasons here. One, institutional investors, things like pension funds, things like people who don't have a large appetite for risk, are only going to trust big firms for the transition. The reason for this is simple. Stability is necessary to justify the short-term loss in profitability without there being worries of the company going bust or falling out of the market. On their side of the house, if you think a small firm has an interesting pitch, which I don't think they're likely to for the reasons I explained, you're unlikely to trust them to pull it off in a way that doesn't lead to them being unable to essentially survive. The second reason, crucially though, and this is something that my opening misses, is that big firms are uniquely posed to do R&D in a way that smaller firms aren't. And this has to do with patents. Note here that even if government is right and you can do the research, you're still not going to do it as a small firm. The reason for this is simple. The large firms are almost always going to reach a breakthrough faster. In doing so, they are going to be the ones to patent said breakthrough, and therefore it's going to be the case that the smaller firms, even if they reach the same result, they won't be able to use it without having to pay immense royalties to the large firms. This therefore means that you know you're never going to win the race against those large firms, and you don't invest in R&D. Given you're not creating a bunch of new small firms, these new firms can never make the switch. The problem then is that the opening opposition mechanism here cannot work. They say that you want to recapture market share by investing in dirty energy. But surely under the motion, it's illegal for you to invest in dirty energy, given that's what got you broken up in the first place. Our MECs address this concern. Note then what happens. Firstly, this affects manufacturers in developing countries much more than others. I'll take a quick PR emoji, sure.
This motion is not to any carbon producer, but for carbon-intensive firms. That is to say that we're talking about people that can change the production and also have the investment to do so.
No, so it's false to say that being carbon intensive necessarily means you can change your practices. Intensity is just about your output. That is your burden in this debate. On to impacts then. One, you're affecting producers in developing economies. The framing here is that these tend to be the biggest polluters because they have the least access to like modern hardware or the most recent patents. This means that it is now far more difficult for them to comply with these requirements, and therefore the farm will likely to pollute more. But also these policies tend to be like a form of disguised protectionism against side producers. Therefore, you're now making it far more difficult for international producers to comply with regulations or to ever become green in countries like India, for example. The second impact, though, is very simple. You're not creating general harms because goods inherently become more expensive for every consumer. We prefer a world where green growth happens without significant harms in terms of increased cost. But also, it's not the case that fewer companies can ever afford to switch their methods. You're creating a market that is artificially more monopolized. You are forcing green growth before the market is able to do it in a way that is cost efficient, and you're essentially making it far, far more difficult to protect the environment in the long term. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to
invite the government whip to close the case for side government.
I think the entirety of the opposition bench relies on the shaky proposition that when pushed, these companies will start to exist. There's existing energy and existing motivation for these large corporations to greenify themselves and to transition. But when you push them even harder, then they're going to suddenly shrink back into their shell and repollute to the highest extent they can to recapture the market. I think it's very, very much more likely on our side of house, as we've told you in our member speech, that when we have this additional incentive, this is not a way for them to recapitulate and retaliate against the market, but rather to instead further go into green energy and support the other industry. They cannot be even more like aggressive as they already are. I think these companies do understand that they profit heavily by not having green energy, and they're going to continue to do so unless the government pushes them into going green. Okay, how I'm going to structure this speech is very simple. First, I'm just going to go house by house or side by side, and then explain why. I think like we give rebuttals and why we went over them, and lastly, do some last like weighing about why exactly our benefit that we give to you is unique in this debate and how we can win. Okay, so first, starting with OO, I think their case relies on the very shaky fact, like we said, that monopolies are good and transitioning is done already. But as soon as this is done, even heavily or pushed by the government, they're going to scrap everything and repollute to recapture the market. Two responses to this. I think firstly, recapturing just doesn't work on their side as a mechanism because there are existing reasons that they gave as to why they want to transition still apply here. So if these companies are so rational and they know that they're going to run out of resources like natural, like fossil fuels eventually, why would they run through them even quicker? And why would they suddenly go through like, okay, might as well just burn through all of the fossil fuels that we have left just to recapture? I think what they can probably do is instead pivot towards more green energy so they can get less antitrust regulations lobbied against them. But secondly, they cannot recapture because the government is probably going to penalize them. So there's going to be more, if they do more heavy polluting, there's going to be in turn more antitrust regulation lobbied against them. So therefore, the best way to actually recapture the market is actually to transition to green technology and accept that they're going to be lobbied. They're arguing with the wall. They have to do these things or else they're going to face the consequences. But secondly, I want to note that current companies do not have a very strong incentive to transition. So taking on this very basic mechanism from OO. Firstly, they just don't have any big urgency or incentive to switch because as of now, it is super profitable. So like Rahul said in his introduction, they maybe have 60 or 70 years still left in like the tank to actually fuel this massive operation. And that's enough for like a few, like one or two people to live and die in absolute wealth. I think people care about that a lot more than to do the posterity of like 2 or 3 generations down the line. They're still going to milk this for all that it's worth and like destroy the earth because they themselves are profited. But secondly, people are short-termist and insulated from societal damages. So I don't trust the big corporations and the people leading them to, feel the damages and feel the very impact and weight of climate change because they are super uber rich, which is why even if they are rational, even if they know climate change does exist, then they don't really care about it because they're making so much money off of it. This is exactly why we need to lobby antitrust regulations against them to uplift companies who are actually going to be green through and through, not just pray and hope that these large companies are going to suddenly have a moral reckoning and therefore go green completely. Okay, so we take on this premise from OO. We also say that the more that they say that carbon intensive like companies will transition, the more unviable the retaliation point is. So we're just going to say that like we're okay with them retaliating, like taking them with their best case scenario, we're okay with them retaliating just so long as we get our biggest benefits, which is like tech innovation and actual small companies thriving and be able to push out good innovation as well. We think that we still have much better benefits over them. Okay, secondly, dealing with CO, I think the first thing to note is like their characterization about EU or Biden USA. Like first of all, lobbying is huge, and we understand understand that other things, like other alternatives, like taxing, carbon tax and things like that can exist, but understand that in these countries, these big corporations have humongous amounts of power. Lobbying is very huge. The way to actually knock them down a peg and really humble them is by understanding that they cannot be as large as they are right now. We're okay with breaking them up to different extents, but note that what Rahul was trying to say is that we can do this strategically. Like, well, obviously, we're not going to break them into little pieces of like shards and fragments so they cannot operate anymore. We're going to do so like over time, in an accumulated way, in a way that is strategic, because as a government, probably not stupid. But secondly, we want to say that small companies making interim technologies and giving them to the market and giving them the market power to do so is the only way to solve CO's identified problem, which is that cheap technology doesn't exist yet. We just simply cannot make this transition. The reason why we actually solve this problem is because right now tech companies do not get we do not get cheap technology because they lack investment to innovate and they lack the market power to do so. Big companies do not seek this tech because of a lack of profit in the status quo. So like I proved to you earlier, but when you get smaller green companies the ability to access a market power, when you get this type of stability afforded to them, you get more investment, you get more power, and that's when you actually get them like able to produce more green or pump out green tech and eventually get that to become a lot more accessible, a lot cheaper. So therefore, we think that we solve and provide an actual solution to what CO's problem is, which is that they think that it's not ready to transition. We have to wait a few more years. We say we're definitely ready to transition now. If we keep on waiting, then the Earth is still going to, probably go through even more damage. But lastly, I just want to deal with CO's really shaky presumption that big corporations are actively and wholeheartedly pursuing transition. If they're better at supplying, we think this policy serves as a way to incentivize them to continue supplying, rather make a transition to supply in more green ways and actually do that so they can roll back on antitrust regulation. But secondly, we'd argue that local communities or smaller scale projects can start supporting green tech now that they have a larger market share. Because understand that that's probably a lower risk, and they probably don't have to take huge endeavors to actually buy into green tech and start implementing that. Those are small wins that we definitely get on our side that CO or O do not get when they have to rely on big companies spearheading this change who are one, reluctant, but two, very unreliable. Lastly, I just want to deal with OG. I think they have very broad antitrust argumentation that lacks depth, even though they are largely similar arguments to us. We do a lot more in terms of engagement with OO's real claim on backlash and real mechanisms. We also do a lot more mechanization on bigger benefits. So we tell you how tech and the way that this policy actually manifests and how this impacts tech development is all unique stuff that we give you as well. And lastly, what do we give you on CG? I think we give you unique tipping points to corporations by telling you how we change their risk calculation in the sense that it now increases risks to not transition to green technology. Now we actually shift government action and public perception against these larger companies. So this means that there's larger reinvestment to green tech when corporation incentives pivot are even higher, they don't recapitulate. But secondly, we also prove to you why tech policy and patents are a lot higher in our side of the house and a lot more accessible because we get higher initial investment, ability to remove the ability for corporations to hoard patents and also get better talent acquisition. For all these reasons, we give you clear margins of ways that we are winning, aka tech and that form of development, as opposed to other sides in this house. We're very, very proud to propose.
Here. Yeah, invite the opposition whip to wrap up the debate.
Can everyone hear me? Oh. Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. I want to start by actually walking through what these markets look like because it's been remarkably unclear in all three other teams. A concentrated market, like a monopoly or oligopoly, is one where consumers have less choice, right? Consumers cannot walk away because you have a few dominant firms. The result of this is that in a concentrated market, prices are high and the transacted quality is low. CO makes the unique claim that it is okay for dirty firms to be monopolistic, because if it is true that prices are high and the quantity is low, that means that consumers are using less dirty technology insofar as dirty tech firms are monopolistic. So we uniquely fulfill the burden of this motion by taking on the worst case scenario. In contrast, a competitive market is one where the price is lower and the quantity transacted is higher. And we would much rather, therefore, green markets be competitive because it means far more consumers will use green products insofar as the price is lower. This already beats all three other teams because it shows why even if you accept the most extreme version of this debate, where on op side, all dirty firms are monopolistic and all green firms are fully competitive, that is a good thing. Nonetheless, let me engage with the rest of this debate. The question I want to answer is, what are we trying to do in this debate? All three other teams have given this nebulous notion of solving climate change with no mechanisms. Only CEO points out to you what we are actually trying to do. What we are trying to do is get dirty companies to become green. Now, CG asks, if it is so profitable to become green, why aren't these companies doing that in the status quo? First, I think this is unresponsive to a lot of what OO tells you about the countervailing political interests of turning green. But even if you accept that those mechanisms are largely weak, I think here is where Chris uniquely fills in. He shows you that what is currently lacking is the capacity for these firms to become green, mostly because of the cost associated with doing so, right? It is not only the case that R&D in green technology is expensive, but also the green products themselves up and down the supply chain are expensive. And government exacerbates this when they increase the market power of green firms and therefore increase the ability of green firms to charge higher prices to downstream suppliers, thereby further delaying the transition. Let me then deal with the actual claims that CG makes. The first thing CG says is there's a huge lobbying power, and the presumable implication of this is that firms on our side exercise that power. If this claim is true, then it applies to their side as well, because it means this policy will be badly applied. If companies can lobby, then they can lobby the government on their side to implement this antitrust policy in a bad way. For example, giving preferential antitrust treatment to firms that are close allies of the incumbent government. So if lobbying exists, it probably cuts both ways. Second, CG says you won't transition because you currently feel no threat to doing so. I think CG's conception of companies is quite medieval, right? Insofar as I have lots of money now, I therefore don't have any risk. That's not true, right? Companies are hugely intelligent actors which are able to forecast risk far better than us as individuals. In fact, they pay people obscene amounts of money to be able to forecast that risk. I suggest, therefore, that companies are much more sensitive to the long-term risks of climate change even than us in this room. Therefore, there is a strong incentive for companies to transition. The reason they are not doing so is the unique link that Chris already filled in. In fact, it is CG where companies don't feel a threat because of the very low burden they take on, where they say, we're not actually breaking up these companies, we're just telling them, strategically, we might break you up in the long term if you do bad things. If you accept this conception of the policy that CG uniquely tries to run, then I don't see how any of the benefits of the government bench apply. The next thing CG does is they give generic antitrust arguments, right? They say, in general, monopolies and oligopolies are bad because they exercise lobbying power and they're able to set prices at an artificially high level. I would note that this does not prove the motion, because the motion asks both government teams to prove why there should be a differential in the level of antitrust regulation between green industries and dirty industries. Notably, the background assumption in this debate that all teams must be operating on is that the government is currently setting the optimal level of antitrust regulation, right? And insofar as that's not the case, the debate doesn't really take place because Chris showed you why it probably takes place in regions like the EU where there is good antitrust regulation. So if the current level of antitrust regulation is optimal, then necessarily government creates market distortion, right? Because they are imposing an excessive degree of antitrust regulation on these dirty industries beyond what the government has deemed economically necessary. That means that they are punishing these dirty firms by allowing them not to reap the profits from, for example, market concentration, which is exactly why these generic antitrust arguments don't apply. Therefore, we fill in the unique mechanism which shows why you actually prevent the switch, right? Which is both that the cost of the switch as well as the cost of the products associated with the switch are excessive. Here is where OO is insufficient, because the reasons they give to you don't make sense, because as government teams note, if OO's reasons were all extremely plausible, then the switch would have already happened insofar as it is extremely profitable in the long run for companies to make that switch. In order to believe OO's case that it is possible for these companies to make a switch, and yet they are not currently doing so, you need to believe what Chris tells you, which is that there are countervailing reasons why companies are not making the switch, and much more importantly, it is the government policy which adds to those reasons. Why is that the case? Because government's policy reduces the supernormal profits that these dirty firms are able to take on, precisely by reducing the market power they have. If that is the case, then the ability to expend this money on, for example, expensive green technology goes down in the world of government, and in fact, fewer companies are able to make that switch. Before I move on, is there an opening POI?
Dirty industries are monopolistic, as you say, because they do not incur in a lot of cost of green technologies. So this is the reason why we have to do the antitrust specifically in these dirty industries.
No, that's not true, right? The reason you don't have to do that is because precisely you want these dirty industries to switch over to green tech firms. Why is that particularly important? And here's where I want to fill in something that CG misses, right? It is not enough just to get rid of these dirty companies and hope that new green tech firms sort of spring out of the ground in the world of CG, right? Because presumably that's kind of what they're operating on. That's not enough because there's a huge body of technical expertise and, for example, the know-how to produce these kinds of goods that only exists with current dirty firms, which is why it is uniquely important that we incentivize those dirty firms to make the transition over to the green industry rather than just trying to let them die off in the long term where climate change happens. Furthermore, we take it over OO because our characterization about the expenses of transition, the expenses associated with transition is necessary to unlock their case. Moreover, unlike OO, we accommodate cases which are somewhat competitive, right? So to believe OO, you need to believe that all dirty industries are completely monopolistic and all green industries are completely competitive. CO uniquely comes in the moderate cases where some dirty industries may be oligopolistic or just somewhat uncompetitive, and we therefore uniquely prove why there's an incentive for companies in those industries to transition. For those reasons, we take it over OO and also prove why the government conception is uniquely flawed. For those reasons, go with CO.
Cool. I thank you all for a wonderful debate. Yeah, you all can leave the room, and I guess you guys will get to know when some of these results are announced. For all adjudicators, I think we can take like 2 minutes